Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Spitfire on My Tail, Part 2. Now, I was in real trouble. I looked at the temperature gauge with horror. It was just passing 130 degrees centigrade. But why? I knew that the engine was probably losing oil from the damage to the supercharger, but that wouldn't account for the abnormal temperature of the coolant. There was only one conclusion. I had been hit during the attack, probably in the radiator. I was now back in the clouds, flying by instruments only. It was time to try for some help. This is Oilet 2A. I have been hit in the radiator. Will try to reach the channel. Taking course from Thames to Manston. Please confirm. The only confirmation was the hiss of static on the radio. Slowly, I had reached 2,000 meters again, still within the cloud base. My speed was well down, and so I decided to give the aircraft a rest. I even talked to it. Now, my yellow 2, see how carefully I will treat you. I will even turn your ignition off, so you don't burn your insides out. We were now gliding and blind flying, which isn't easy under such conditions. Never before had I tried so hard to keep the pointer straight and the mercury ball in the middle of the circle, not even when I had the most discerning instructor beside me. And it worked. At 1,200 meters, I could see the ground again, but I still went further. I wanted the oil to get as much cooling as possible. Now that I could see the ground again, I didn't have to concentrate on the instruments so much. I decided to try another radio call. Maybe the clouds had affected the quality of the transmission before. This is Oilet 2A. Have been shot in the radiator. Will probably make it to the channel. Confirm. This time the ground station in France replied, Understood, Oilet 2A. Air-sea rescue will be notified. Only go into the water when absolutely necessary. Think about Geller. I recognized the voice of good old Hauptmann Förster from the ground station in Calais. He was reminding me that our adjutant, Lieutenant Geller, had made an emergency landing in the channel some months before and, unfortunately, drowned. I wasn't worried about drowning. I would be happy to make it through the water. Just the day for a swim, I thought. Things began to get better and my spirits lifted. I recognized the voice of my squadron leader on the radio. He must have heard my message to Calais. This is Euler. Message intercepted and understood. Have some fuel left. Will start to search the channel immediately. Rest of group will be back, refuel and return to search. That couldn't be better. They could find me and protect me in the water whilst giving air-sea rescue my position. Earlier, I had participated in similar missions. Then, I was down to 500 meters and began to attract some light anti-aircraft fire. I could see a small town but did not recognize it. This was the time. Ignition on. The propeller was being constantly turned by the airflow, and so there was no problem in restarting the engine. Just before I entered the clouds, I transmitted a better fix for the ground station, telling them that I would fly a fixed course of 100 degrees magnetic. It would all help them to find me in the water. So far so good. The engine was running very well, no special noises and adequate power. But the oil temperature began to rise as I watched it. As I reached cloud base, I noticed 100 degrees centigrade and rising. There was only one sensible thing to do, cut the engine and glide again. As I glided down, I could see what I thought was the Bay of Manston, and I gave this as my new position. My chief was talking to the ground station, and they confirmed that the air-sea rescue was on their way. Communications really were excellent now that I was constantly below the cloud base. All too soon I was at 250 meters and had to act quickly. I turned on the ignition and pushed the throttle forward gently. The engine fired immediately, but after a few moments it started to run very rough. I eased the throttle back as much as possible, but with so little power I could barely maintain altitude. My heart thumped against my ribs, and I sweated in spite of the freezing October temperatures. Even with a minimum throttle setting, the engine cried out in pain. It was now metal on metal. How long could this last? A last hope. Full throttle. Maybe it would help. And it certainly did, and the engine ceased. There was no bang or disintegration of the engine parts, just a soft silence. I had never known this before in a 109, just the whistling of the wind as it passed at about 220 kilometers per hour. There was only one choice now. Bail out. A last desperate radio message. This is Oilet 2A. Engine ceased, bailing out. The message sounded ridiculously loud in the quiet of the cockpit. It was fantastic how many thoughts went through my mind in a few seconds. Should I try to land? No. I must destroy my aircraft. It must not fall into enemy hands. I ran through the emergency procedures in my head. Oxygen equipment off. Throat microphone off. Remove flying helmet with headphones. Poor Yellow 2, I thought. This is your last moment. I pulled the lever to jettison the canopy. But all that happened was that the safety seal came off in my hand and the release lever wouldn't move anymore. I glanced at the altimeter. Only 250 meters. I must hurry. There was only one choice. Open the canopy as normal. This would allow me to get out, but the rear section would stay in place. I pulled the lever and pushed up on the perspex. There was a sudden explosion of wind noise as loose items were sucked out of the cockpit by the slipstream. I gasped as freezing air poured into the aircraft. The canopy was wrenched from my hand by the air pressure and torn off the hinges. I heard it rumble down the side of the fuselage before it fell into the void below. Now it was my turn. I released the seat belts and pushed up into the gale which was buffeting my body. Suddenly, disaster struck. The slipstream had forced my body backwards, wedging my parachute under the rear section of the canopy. My legs were jammed under the instrument panel, and I was being bent backwards. I tried to claw my hands down towards the control column to bring her up into a stall, but I couldn't reach. To my horror, I saw that the aircraft began her last dive. Slowly, she rolled to the right, and the nose began to drop into a critical dive. There was only one option for me now. I had to risk tearing my parachute pack. I leaned out to the right, and with great effort, I pulled my legs up towards my body. Suddenly I was out and rolling along the side of the aircraft. Even at only 200 kilometers per hour, you are the victim of a power storm. I somersaulted head over heels and hoped that with luck I would pass the tail without injury. After a second I was clear, but still rolling over and over as I fell towards the ground. Now, all I had to do was pull the release of the parachute. My hand reached up to my left shoulder, and I took a firm hold of the handle and pulled. Then I waited, but nothing happened. It was only a split second, but it seemed way too long. My hands groped behind me to try to assist the pack opening, but already a mass of silk and shroud lines was boiling up between my legs, and the drogue chute, with unbelievable skill, had wound itself around my left leg. As the main parachute deployed, I began a series of gyrations which would have done credit to a circus performer. As the canopy opened fully, I shouted out in pain. It felt as though my left leg was being torn off. The circus act was over as suddenly as it began, but I found that I was hanging by my leg, spinning in a perfect inverted axle. Then I dropped with a jolt as I became upright once more. I checked that my canopy was fully open and then looked down to my left leg. I was sure that it would be missing, but there it was, hanging limply below me. I tried to move it, but the pain was excruciating. Just at that moment I saw my brave Yellow 2 diving towards some soft ground in the middle of a herd of cows. They scattered in all directions, running with their tails up. Then there was a soft thump as she entered the ground, the 20mm ammunition starting to go off immediately, a kind of ridiculous last salute. Now I was close to the ground, and I must prepare for landing. I was swinging gently like the pendulum of a clock. With luck, I landed on the right leg and, as I had estimated, the ground was soft. Things couldn't have been better for my injured leg. Before landing, I had turned the parachute harness buckle to unlock it, ready for landing. Now that I was down, I thumped the knob and the webbing harness fell to the ground. In great silken billows, the parachute dropped onto the green grass, no more than 5 meters away. From here, I couldn't see the crash site of Yellow 2, but I could still hear the ammunition exploding. I had landed beside the embankment of a canal, and this obscured my view in one direction. I looked around at the countryside to see if anyone was approaching. Nothing. Only the grey, wet drizzle, blown by the wind. I couldn't believe that just moments before I had been flying in the bright sunshine. Above the clouds, I could hear the throb of engines as my comrades made their way back to base. How far away from them I was now. I felt so alone, so hopeless, my throat tightened, and I thought that I was about to cry. Then the moment passed. It was time to consider my new position. I began to drop my equipment, which was still with me: rubber dinghy, seawater dye container, flare pistol. Bang! There was a shot. My infantry training took over, and I was down on the ground, raising my head to see who was shooting. After all I had survived in the past few minutes, was I to be shot dead in a cow field? I lay there for a while, my face pressed against the damp grass. Gradually, I raised my head and peered across the dike towards the place from where the sound of the shot had come. I saw a man in civilian clothes, holding what seemed to be a shotgun. He had an armband tied around the left sleeve of his jacket. "Get up!" he shouted. My mind went back to the schoolroom, and I tried to string my English words together. "I can't," I shouted across the water. "My leg is hurt." I don't think he imagined that I was unarmed. I tried to walk up the bank of the dike, but I collapsed in pain. "I'll come around to you," he shouted to me. I sat there on the cold, coarse marsh grass and felt the dampness of the ground through my flying clothes. I was really depressed now. I couldn't get away, my leg was too badly hurt, so I had to sit and wait, whilst my would-be captor made his way around the dike. While I waited, I began to think about the events in my life that had brought me to this bleak and inhospitable place. My schooling, Hitlerjugend, labor service, early flying training, and then my years and tribulations in the Luftwaffe. A long, long journey for one who was still so young. So, Ulrich has crashed after probably taking a hit through the radiator of his 109. What an opening to this new book. I hope you are as excited as I am to find out how he grew up in the 1920s southern Germany. Some interesting things to note in this episode. Ulrich says that he is unarmed and that the British farmer will recognize him as such. At the time, German pilots no longer carried sidearms. This was forbidden in September of 1940, as it was discovered that many pilots who were shot down over the channel and had to ditch would use the sidearm to spare themselves from slowly succumbing to exposure and taking the quick way out. Luftwaffe High Command took this as evidence that they'd quit too early and thus took that option away from them, which is pretty grim. What is not grim, though, is your continued support, which I appreciate immensely. So I will see you next time. Until then, like, comment, subscribe. Cheers.